Today I'm not here to talk to you about a city under occupation, or a drone strike, or a president's speech. Today I'm here to talk to you about something that sounds boring, but can actually change. A war. Logistics. Yes, trucks, trains, cargo planes, routes, warehouses, coordination, because in modern war, there's a brutal truth. Almost nobody says this directly. It's not always the side that shoots more that wins. The winner is the side that manages to make sure the front line never runs out of what it needs, and what's needed isn't just weapons. It's parts, batteries, spare components, fuel, radars, ammunition, medicines, vehicle repair equipment, things that don't show up in photos, but that decide whether a brigade holds or breaks. Now think about this with me, without overcomplicating it. If Ukraine is fighting today, it's because, besides soldiers, it has a support line. And if that line gets cut, the front line runs out of air. Like a person running out of oxygen. That's logistical strangulation when your army is there, determined, brave, but without what it needs to survive and fight. And here comes the key point. For nearly 3 years, a large part of Western aid to Ukraine has gone through one main route, a very important corridor, a critical point, a place that if it gets overloaded or complicated can delay everything. Everything depends on a single point. That point becomes a risk. You don't need to destroy it to cause damage. You just need to pressure it. You just need it to slow down, and when it slows down, the damage is felt far away, but paid for up close, at the front. A one-day delay can become a breach. A week can become a retreat. A month can become a kind of wear that's hard to recover from. Why this topic hits so hard? Because war isn't only who advances, it's also who endures. And now comes the news that changes everything. Romania. It is stepping in as a second major gateway for the flow of aid to Ukraine. This isn't just any headline. It's not a nice announcement. It's a serious, large, structural decision. And most importantly, people are saying this new center will enter operation toward the end of January 2026, working in parallel with the main hub that already exists in Poland. Now before someone says, so what? I'll put it simply. If Ukraine used to depend on a single highway, it's now opening a second highway. And that means one very simple thing. It'll be harder to stop the flow. Not impossible, not invincible, but harder. And in a long war, harder can be the difference between holding on and collapsing. Now let me paint the scene as it really is, so it feels real. Imagine a cold night. Roads with rain, mud, fog. Lines of trucks. Warehouses lit by harsh white light. People checking lists, checking crates, checking equipment. It's not a movie, it's routine. And yet, that routine sustains lives. Because at the front, when someone hears a missile and has seconds to react, they depend on an air defense system that cannot fail. And that system depends on parts, and those parts depend on a route. And that route depends on the flow not breaking. That simple, that cruel. That's why I knew logistics. The center isn't just a warehouse. It's a place where the flow gets organized. Where they decide what arrives first. Where chaos gets prevented. It's a brain. And here's another key word: coordination. Because the problem isn't only sending weapons. The problem is sending the right thing, on time, to the right place. If it arrives late, it's useless. If you send something that isn't needed in that moment, it's useless. If you send things without order, it turns into a disaster. That's why this is tied to a NATO coordination system called NSA, which is responsible for organizing that aid. And here's the detail that shows the scale of all this. In 2025, this system facilitated the delivery of approximately 220,000 tons of military aid, moved by thousands of trucks, rail cars, and hundreds of flights. Do you understand what that means? That isn't a shipment. That's a war industry operating like a production chain. And when you add a second major logistics base to that chain, you're doing two things at the same time. You increase capacity, more flow, more speed. You reduce risk if one route gets saturated. There's another option, and that's when the story becomes truly dramatic, because this doesn't only help Ukraine, it also sends a message to Russia, a message that feels like this: we no longer depend on a single door. And that changes the game, because for years Russia has tried to find weak points, where to pressure, where to grind down, where to break the chain. If there was one single point, it was easier to focus. But if there are two routes, two entrances, two flows, Russia has to split attention, split intelligence, split pressure. And when you split pressure, effectiveness drops. It's like you used to have just one lock. And now they put two doors in front of you. It doesn't mean you can't get in, but it does mean it's no longer that simple. And here's where I'll tell you something that sounds obvious, but isn't. This war is also fought through quiet decisions. Not every decision comes with sirens. Not every decision makes the front page. But when an alliance opens a new logistics structure, it isn't thinking about tomorrow. It's thinking in months and years. And that carries a heavy meaning. This sounds like preparation for a long conflict, because nobody builds a massive support system to use it. For 2 weeks they do it because they're preparing to sustain. And sustaining is what defines attrition. Now let me ask you a question. If you were Russia and you see the bottleneck shrinking, what do? Do you sit there with your arms crossed, or do you try to change the play? Because here's the unsettling part. When you remove one weak point from your enemy, that side looks for another weak point, and that's where this story turns dangerous, because this isn't only about more trucks, it's about what happens when Russia realizes the flow now has a backup, that it's no longer a single road. It's about what Russia tries to do when it sees the chain becoming more resilient, and that takes us straight into Chapter 2, where we're going to talk about the key point in Poland, why it was so important, why it became vulnerable due to saturation and risk, and why Romania's route isn't a detail. It's a second artery, an artery that can sustain the pace, and when the pace holds, the front changes. Because in this war, I'll say it again, it's not always the one who shouts the loudest who wins, it's the one who endures, the one who doesn't run out of air, the one who keeps their support line from collapsing. And now, with a second door opening in the south, the question is simple, but terrifying. What will Russia do to prevent that door from working? Now, yes, let's get to the point that made all of this so delicate for years. When I say bottleneck, I'm not saying it as a pretty metaphor. I mean it as a practical reality. A large part of Western aid to Ukraine has depended on a main hub in Poland, near Osianka, which became a kind of gate through which the most important things passed. This isn't a secret, or some weird theory, it's logic. If you have to move tons of equipment non-stop, for months and years, you need a place with infrastructure, fast routes, rail connections, airlift capacity, and constant coordination. That point in Poland served that function, and that's why it became essential. But here's the problem. When a place becomes essential, it also becomes fragile, not because it's weak by itself, but because everything depends on it. And when everything depends on a single point, three dangers appear at the same time: congestion, strategic risk, and political and psychological pressure. Let's start with the simplest one: congestion. Picture a highway jam. You don't need a crash for it to collapse. It's enough to have too many cars. In wartime logistics, it's the same. There comes a moment when the issue isn't whether you have aid, but whether you can move it at the speed required. You're not moving one box, you're moving thousands, not once a month, but every single day. And on top of that, demand spikes suddenly. One day there's an offensive and ammunition consumption shoots up. Another day there's a wave of strikes and suddenly air defenses must be reinforced. Another day a system fails and spare parts are needed immediately. When all of that hits one single hub, that hub becomes a funnel, and a funnel always has the same problem. It fills up faster than it can empty. That's where delays begin. And I'll tell you something. A delay in wartime logistics doesn't sound dramatic, but it's brutal, because a delay means units rationing supplies, defenses that aren't reinforced in time, equipment out of service because one part is missing, and desperate decisions like, hold with what you've got. In a long war, that breaks you from the inside. Now, if this was already serious, here's what makes it even tenser. Strategic risk. This is where the story shifts. Because if you were Russia and you saw that a large part of the aid is coming in through one main hub, you wouldn't necessarily think, I'm going to destroy it, because that would be a massive escalation. But you would think, I'm going to understand it, I'm going to measure it, I'm going to pressure it indirectly. Because when everything goes through the same place, the enemy can predict movements, concentrate intelligence, and look for ways to disrupt things without crossing certain lines. Sometimes you don't need an explosion. Sometimes it's enough to inject fear through threats, propaganda, incidents, indirect sabotage, disinformation. I'm not saying everything always happens the same way, but that kind of game exists when there's a single critical point. And when you have one critical point, you live with a constant anxiety. What if something affects it? That question gets stuck in your head. And the third danger is the most human one: political and psychological pressure. People think logistics is cold. It isn't. Logistics is people coordinating, people making decisions under pressure, people carrying the stress of knowing that if something is delayed, it isn't a package that's delayed, it's a piece of the front line. When everyone knows your main hub is the gate, any delay becomes a scandal, any failure becomes a political argument, any rumor becomes a weapon. And that also wears down the allies, because the game starts: why isn't it arriving? Who's taking too long? What failed? Who promised something they couldn't deliver? In a long war, that wear and tear among allies matters too. So Ukraine wasn't only fighting Russia, it was fighting the clock, the congestion, the uncertainty of its own support chain. And I want you not to lose the core idea here. It doesn't matter how much you send if everything enters through one funnel. The funnel is in charge. That's why for years the question floated around that nobody wanted to say this directly: what happens if this gate becomes insufficient? Not if it gets attacked, not if it blows up, but if it gets saturated. The pace of the front line becomes faster than the pace of delivery, because the front line doesn't wait. The front line consumes, and when it consumes faster than support arrives, you enter survival mode. And in survival mode you make mistakes, and mistakes cost lives. That's why this topic is so powerful, because a second gate, a second strong route, isn't a luxury, it's insurance. And here comes the quiet fear. If there's only one big route, the enemy can spot patterns. They can see when movement increases, when it drops, when there are spikes, where activity concentrates. Even if they can't stop it completely, they can try to make it more expansive, slower, more tense, forcing you to spend more on protection, forcing you to spread defenses, forcing you to react. And when you only have one big road, you react more icily because there's no alternative. So I'll put it in one sentence. Anyone can understand the real power isn't having a route, it's having options. Without options, you're trapped. With options, you can breathe. And that's where the word that changes everything appears: backup, a plan B. That's what Romania represents in this story. If one route gets saturated, the other absorbs part of the hit. If one gets complicated, the other keeps the flow moving. If one becomes a pressure point, the other reduces the risk. It's not magic, it's redundancy. And in war, redundancy is survival. Now the question is inevitable. Does this really change the war? The honest answer is this: it doesn't change the war because someone suddenly wins tomorrow. It changes the war because it reduces the risk of collapse. And in an attrition conflict, preventing a collapse can be more important than winning a battle, because a battle can be lost and recovered, but a logistical collapse can drag everything down. And here's where the story enters its strongest part. After years of depending on one main gate, the announcement comes that there will be a new center in Romania operating in parallel. And that phrase, "in parallel," is the one that can break the bottleneck logic. Because when the enemy sees its attrition bet losing strength, it changes tactics. So the question that opens what comes next is simple, but unsettling. What exactly does it mean for the Romanian hub to operate in parallel land? Why is that single idea the one that bothers Moscow the most? Now comes the announcement that makes all of this stop being theory and become a real move. We're not talking about maybe someday. We're talking about a plan with a date and a structure. A second logistics center in Romania that will enter operation and work in parallel with the main hub that already existed. And that word "in parallel" is what changes everything. Because it means the system stops depending on a single artery. It goes from being a fragile cord to a network with backup. It's not magic. It's not that Ukraine wins the war tomorrow. It's something colder, more real, and more important. It reduces the risk of collapse. Think of it like this. If Ukraine has spent years breathing through a single mask, now they're putting a second one on. It doesn't mean there's no danger anymore. It means it will be harder to choke the flow. And the heaviest part of the announcement is the detail that this is integrated into a NATO coordination system, meaning it's not improvisation. It's order, discipline, a control desk where they decide what arrives first, what gets sent next, through which route, and with what urgency. When support becomes a system, time becomes a weapon. And in this conflict, time is worth more than metal. Because, at the front, it arrived today is not the same as it arrived in a week. And that's the punch. A second hub isn't an extra warehouse, it's a way to sustain the pace. And when you sustain the pace, you sustain the front. But be careful, because this isn't a happy ending. It's a change of the board, and every change of the board forces the other side to respond. That's why the real question isn't what is a hub. The real question is, what changes when the flow has backup, and what does Russia do when it sees its attrition bets becoming harder? A lot of people hear logistics and think of boxes and warehouses. But what's moving here is massive, almost industrial. This isn't a one-off delivery. It's a constant flow, day after day, with thousands of small decisions that, together, determine whether the front holds or breaks. And when a system like that gets stretched to the limit, what kills it isn't always a direct attack. Many times it's congestion overload, accumulated delays. So when a second strong center appears, what it really does is open up capacity, speed things up, distribute the burden, reduce funnels. It's like when a highway is already collapsing and suddenly another route opens. Traffic doesn't disappear forever, but the system stops being one step away from suffocation. And in war, being one step away from suffocation is living on the edge of disaster. Because when the flow is delayed once, the front feels it. When it's delayed twice, survival mode starts. And when survival mode becomes routine, losses go up. So the value of this decision isn't, in a pretty phrase, it's that it adds muscle to the flow and reduces the risk of running out of air right when the enemy squeezes hardest. Here comes the twist that changes the story and makes it so powerful for a video. Two routes force Russia to split its attention with one dominant route. The enemy can watch one point, study one pattern, concentrate pressure, concentrate intelligence, concentrate propaganda, concentrate threats. With two major routes, the board splits in two. And when the board splits in two, Russia has to spread resources, spread surveillance, spread plans. And when you spread plans, you become less efficient. It's not that Russia runs out of options, it's that its bets become more expensive. Before, you could imagine concentrated pressure on one bottleneck. Now that bottleneck shrinks. Now there's backup. Now there's an option. And in a long war, having options is breathing. There's also a detail that weighs heavily when there isn't just one door. Deliveries become less predictable, not invisible. but less easy to measure with a single pulse. Less pattern means more uncertainty, and uncertainty ruins plans. That's why this is uncomfortable, because a war isn't sustained only with weapons. It's sustained with confidence that the flow won't fail, and when the flow becomes more resilient, the attrition strategy becomes harder to execute. Now let's ground the question. People always ask, what's most urgently needed at the front? I'll tell you without overcomplicating it. Ukraine needs things that sustain day-to-day survival. It needs air defense to withstand waves of attacks. It needs ammunition and artillery so it doesn't lose tempo. It needs equipment that reduces the enemy's advantage in drones and strikes. And it needs tools to sustain communications, maintenance, and protection. And what makes this dramatic is that these things don't matter if they arrive late. An air defense battery can't be restored with a speech. A battalion can't hold with words if there's no replenishment, no parts, no coordination. The front becomes fragile. That's why a second logistics center doesn't feel like an extra, it feels like a shock absorber against moments of panic. It reduces those dangerous pauses when someone has to say, "Hold with what we've got." And that sentence, in war, it is a verdict, because when you fight with just enough, every mistake costs you twice as much. So the value of the new flow is simple. Maintain continuity, maintain tempo, avoid the void the enemy is trying to create. And here comes the political side, the part that takes the story to the next level. One thing is sending aid. Another thing is building a system to sustain it. When an alliance like NATO organizes a scheme with coordination, priorities, and new routes, the message is clear. This is being prepared to last. This isn't a one-month impulse. It's an architecture. And you build architecture when you want to sustain. Something with continuity there are also prioritization and procurement mechanisms, aimed at getting the most urgent items. They're not what looks best in photos. And that removes part of the improvisation from the conflict. It makes it more stable. And if support becomes more stable, Russia understands something else. Winning by exhaustion will be more expensive, because the attrition bet needs the other side to fail. And if the other side strengthens its logistical resilience, that failure takes longer to arrive, or maybe it doesn't arrive in the way Russia expected. So the conflict hardens, costs rise, tensions rise. And in that environment, any incident, any rumor, any movement at the border or at sea becomes more delicate, because it's no longer only about the front, it's about commitment. Now we get to the question that puts the audience on the edge of their seat. How does Russia respond? Here we have to be honest and simple. We're not saying this will happen tomorrow, but we can understand the pattern. When one side sees its main strategy losing strength, it usually moves in three directions. The first is noise, propaganda, threats, psychological pressure, trying to plant fear or doubts in the countries sustaining the chain. The second is hybrid pressure, indirect actions like disinformation, cyber attacks, attempts at small sabotage, confusion, incidents that aren't always easy to prove but all aimed at one thing, making the system slower and more expensive. The third is hitting the Ukrainian side of the chain, infrastructure, energy, transport networks inside Ukraine, because if you can't stop the entry, you try to destroy what's closer to the point of use. And here's the clearest phrase of all. When you can't cut the tap, you try to break the pipe. The goal isn't always to destroy everything. Sometimes it's to cause enough delays that the front slips back into survival mode. But here's the change. With two routes, the board gets more complicated. It's no longer one single pressure point. It's no longer one single target. Now there's backup. And that backup takes away one very dangerous Russian bet, the hope that everything can be choked through a single bottleneck. And now we close with what matters most, without selling fantasy. This doesn't mean Ukraine wins tomorrow. This doesn't mean Russia runs out of tools. This doesn't mean the war becomes easy. What it does mean, and this is huge, that it reduces a major risk, the risk that one single funnel becomes the failure point that drags everything down. In a war of attrition, reducing that risk is a silent victory, because if the enemy is betting you'll run out of air, and you create backup, you break part of the plan, you raise the cost, you stretch the timeline, you complicate their life. So if this second hub enters operation as expected and truly works in parallel, the war changes from the inside. The tempo changes, resilience changes, the likelihood of major interruptions changes. And the last question hangs in the air, because it's the one that opens your next video and keeps the audience hooked. If Russia can no longer rely on a single bottleneck, what will be its next way to apply pressure and regain an advantage?